Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Driven Wyld. Today we are talking about final rule, employee or independent contractor classification under the Fair Labor Standards Act. So we all seen the news about this rule being implemented on March 11th, 2024, but yet we haven't actually discussed too deeply about the rule itself. And I do believe not looking at this can lead to a lot of fear mongering, especially from the media side of things, because Doordash and Uber Eats believe that we aren't going to be influenced by this. And I would like to see what their perspective is on why. So with that said, I want to go over everything that is being said on the Department of Labor's website on the subject. What they're saying, what Doordash is saying, what Uber Eats is saying versus how it actually is, and everything in between. So with that said, let's get started. Substance of the final rule. What analysis guides whether a worker is an employee or independent contractor under this final rule? This final rule continues to affirm that a worker is not an independent contractor if they are, as a matter of economic reality, economically dependent on an employer for work. Consistent with the judicial precedent and the department's interpretive guidance prior to 2021, the final rule applies to the following 6 factors to analyze employee or independent contractor status under the FLSA. Opportunity for profit or loss depending on managerial skill, investments by the worker and potential employer, degree of permanence of the work relationship, nature and degree of control, extent to which the work performed is an integral part of the potential employer's business, and skill and initiative. The final rule provides detailed guidance regarding the application of each of these 6 factors. No factor or set of factors among this list of 6 has a predetermined weight, and additional factors may be relevant if such factors in some way indicate whether the worker is in business for themselves, i.e. an independent contractor, as opposed to being economically dependent on the employer for work, i.e. an employee under the FLSA. This rule doesn't actually affect the worker classification under other laws. It's just for the department's interpretation under the Fair Labor Standards Act. Now, it is very similar to the rule in 2021. Now, I feel like there's a lot of debate that you can have for each of these 6 factors, so let's go over each of them as follows. How does the final rule explain opportunity for profit or loss depending on managerial skill? This factor considers whether the worker has opportunities for profit or loss based on managerial skill, including initiative or business acumen or judgment, that affect the worker's economic success or failure in performing work. The following facts, among others, can be relevant: whether the worker determines or can meaningfully negotiate the charge or pay for the work provided, whether the worker accepts or declines jobs or chooses the order and or time in which the jobs are performed, whether the worker engages in marketing, advertising, or other efforts to expand their business or secure more work, and whether the worker makes decisions to hire others, purchase materials and equipment, and or rent space. If a worker has no opportunity for profit or loss, then this factor suggests that the worker is an employee. Some decisions by a worker that can affect the amount of pay that a worker receives, such as the decision to work more hours or take more jobs, when paid a fixed rate per hour or per job, generally do not reflect the exercise of managerial skill, indicating independent contractor status under this factor. Okay, so let's quickly talk about each of those points. Whether the worker determines or can meaningfully negotiate the charge or pay for the work provided. Now, a lot of people are going to argue this like, no, we just get a set number sent to us and we either accept or decline. The fact that you could decline the job at all allows you the ability to negotiate. That's not what I want. I'm going to say no. Now, you could also say that's addressed in the second factor, whether the worker accepts or declines jobs or chooses the order and or time in which the jobs are performed. In the food delivery space, there's very limited options for that. If the customer needs it by a certain time, whether Whether we're available to take it or not is going to be a very different subject. But we can always say no if we're not available to accept that job. There are some apps that allow you to change the time, but you would have to talk to support, and support doesn't actually support people, and usually is just a bigger headache than it's worth. Whether the worker engages in marketing, advertising, or other efforts to expand their business or secure more work, that's why I keep telling you, diversify your income, start your own gig, develop an exit strategy, so that way you can have more opportunities for yourself. But there are still a lot of people that sign up for the one app and then bitch about the one app is not paying them enough. Whether the worker makes decisions to hire others, purchase materials and equipment, and or rent space. You can purchase your own materials and equipment. That's 100% on you to have your own hot bags and any equipment you may find necessary, your own vehicles, etc., and or rent space, which we may or may not need. A lot of us either work out of our homes, have a P.O. box, or something to that effect. So there is an argument to be made on both sides of this spectrum, whether we are or not an independent contractor. And of course, the gig apps are going to fight that we are going to be independent contractors, so there is a level of light for that. How does the final rule explain investments by the worker and the employer? This factor considers whether any investments by a worker are capital or entrepreneurial in nature. Costs to the worker of tools and equipment to perform a specific job, costs of workers' labor, and costs that the potential employer imposes unilaterally on the worker, for example, are not evidence of capital or entrepreneurial investment and indicate employee status. Investments that are capital or entrepreneurial in nature and thus indicate independent contractor status generally support an independent business and serve a business-like function, such as increasing a worker's ability to do different jobs of more work, reducing costs, or extending market reach. Additionally, the worker's investments should be considered on a relative basis with the potential employer's investments in its overall business. The worker's investments do not have to be equal to the potential employer's investments and should not be compared only in terms of dollar values of investments or the sizes of the worker and the potential employer. Instead, the focus should be on comparing the investments to determine whether the worker is making similar types of investments as the potential employer, even on a smaller scale, to suggest that the worker is operating independently, which would indicate the independent contractor status. For some reason, I feel like the latter point kind of contradicts the former point. Cost to a worker of tools and equipment to perform a specific job, cost to the worker's labor, and cost that the potential employer imposes unilaterally on the worker, for example, are not evidence of capital or entrepreneurial investment and indicate employee status. Which, if you were to argue for the employee side, you would say the wear and tear on the vehicle, the hot bags and whatever equipment you would need for transportation, and whatever equipment you would use to transport certain items, those would in fact be investments towards the potential employer, even on a smaller scale. And besides, the type of work in which we can do more than just food delivery. It could do grocery delivery, it could do package delivery, it could do a bunch of different types of deliveries, really. Medical courier, legal courier, etc. For some reason, I feel like this needs to be broken down into a little bit more detail of what qualifies and what doesn't on each side. And I feel like there's going to be a huge legal battle on that front. How does the final rule explain degree of permanence of the work relationship? This factor weighs in favor of the worker being an employee when the work relationship is indefinite in duration, continuous, or exclusive of work for other employers. This factor weighs in favor of the worker being an independent contractor when the work relationship is definite in duration, non-exclusive, project-based, or sporadic based on the worker being in business for themselves and marketing their services or labor to multiple entities. This may include regularly occurring fixed periods of work, although the seasonal or temporary nature of the work by itself would not necessarily indicate independent contractor classification, where the lack of permanence is due to operational characteristics that are unique or intrinsic to particular businesses or industries and the workers they employ. This factor is not necessarily indicative of independent contractor status unless the worker is exercising their own independent business initiative. I feel like they're playing games with the wording here. So these are the guidelines lines in which you're determining it, but they don't necessarily indicate that they are or aren't. Which is it? Pick one. But nevertheless, let's talk about what they were saying. Definite in duration, non-exclusive, project-based, or sporadic based on the worker being in business for themselves and marketing their services or labor to multiple entities. Multi-app-based, project-based, you're working on individual deliveries. Non-exclusive, we're not only on DoorDash, we're not only on Uber Eats, we're not only on Grubhub or Instacart or Veho or Amazon Flex or anything like that. We're non-exclusive. And definite in duration. The only thing I would say that is going to be a little shaky is sometimes we can get the job done faster, but I don't think you can make that argument in a courtroom. It's definite in duration being when the job is done, it's done. There are going to be times where you have to work around certain things or have to reroute or something like that, but it's never going to be anything that isn't based on event that takes place. But I think that basically does define it in duration. Not necessarily by time, but in terms of when it's completed. How does the final rule explain nature and degree of control? This factor considers the potential employer's control, including reserved control over the performance of the work and the economic aspects of the working relationship. Facts relevant to the potential employer's control over the worker include whether the potential employer sets the worker's schedule, supervises the performance of the work, or explicitly limits the worker's ability to work for others. Additionally, facts are relevant to the potential employer's control over the worker include whether the potential employer uses technological means to supervise their performance of the work, such as by means of a device or electronically, reserves the right to supervise or discipline workers, or places demands or restrictions on workers that do not allow them to work for others or work when they choose. Whether the potential employer controls the economic aspects of the working relationship should also be considered, including control over the prices or rates for services and marketing of the services or products provided by the worker. Actions taken by the potential employer for the sole purpose of complying with the specific applicable federal, state, tribal, or local law or regulation are not indicative of control. As example of such compliance actions that are not indicative of control, the final rule identifies a publication's requirement that a writer must comply with the libel law and a home care agency's requirement that all individuals with patient contract undergo background checks in compliance with a specific Medicaid regulation. Actions taken by employers that go beyond compliance with a specific applicable federal, state, tribal, or local law of regulation and instead serve the potential employer's own compliance method, safety, quality control, or contractual or customer service standards may be indicative of control. For example, a home agency's imposition of extensive provider qualifications, such as fulfilling comprehensive training requirements beyond training required for relevant licenses, may be probative of control. More control the potential employer favors employee status, more control by the worker favors independent contractor. I feel like this depends on how well diversified you are as a gig worker, because every app to a certain degree has throttling, every app to a certain degree has some sort of rating system, and that's not just for you, that's for them, and we all know that. And can you also say that they supervise the performance of work, such as by means of device or electronically? You could say contract violations, such as the order never arrived or the wrong order was delivered, even though that wasn't our fault. But at the same time, that is still your responsibility to make sure the order is delivered. And is that the platform, or is that the customer reporting that the order was delivered or reporting that the wrong order never arrived when it wasn't your fault to begin with? Or extreme lateness is another one to where you can make that argument. I feel like this is going to lead to certain changes on the platform, but it's not going to change the independent contractor status of most gig workers in the actual gig economy. How does the final rule explain extent to which the work performed is an integral part of the employer's business? This factor considers whether the work performed is an integral part of the potential employer's business. This factor does not depend on whether any individual worker in particular is an integral part of the business, but rather whether the function they perform is an integral part of the business. This factor weighs in favor of the worker being an employee when the work they perform is critical, necessary, or central to the potential employer's principal business. This factor weighs in favor of the worker being an independent contractor when the work they perform is not critical, necessary, necessary or central to the potential employer's principal business. Oh, that's where we would get our butts whooped. A last mile delivery service requiring people to deliver for them. That would absolutely annihilate us, by far. How does the final rule explain skill and initiative? This factor considers whether the worker uses specialized skills to perform the work and whether those skills contribute to business-like initiative. This factor indicates employee status where the worker does not use specialized skills in performing the work, or where the worker is dependent on training from the potential employer to perform the work. Where the worker brings specialized skills to the work relationship, this fact is not in itself indicative of independent contractor status because both employees and independent contractors may be skilled workers. It is the worker's use of those specialized skills in connection with the business-like initiative that indicates that the worker is an independent contractor. All right, this feels like a trap within itself, though. You're definitely not an independent contractor if you don't bring specialized skills, but you could be an independent contractor if you have specialized skills and are using it during your work. So which is it? Based on the 6 factors so far, 2 of them are traps, 1 of them we would get our butts whooped, and the rest are under huge interpretation. So realistically speaking, only 1 of them actually affects us. When might additional factors matter in determining a worker's employment status? Under the final rule, additional factors may be relevant in determining whether the worker is an employee or independent contractor for the purposes of the FLSA. If the factors in some way indicate whether the worker is in business for themselves as opposed to being economically dependent on the potential employer for work, this guidance is identical to guidance provided in the 2021 independent contractor rule and is consistent with judicial precedent. If you can prove that there are other factors that say you're in business for yourself, they can use that, but otherwise, no. Under the final rule, when does a worker have to satisfy all economic reality factors to qualify as an independent contractor? No. Under the economic reality test, no single factor or set of factors automatically determines a worker's status as either an employee or an independent contractor. Instead, the economic reality factors are all weighted to assess whether a worker is economically dependent on a potential employer for work according to the totality of the circumstances. And that is exactly the point, because based on the 6 factors, 1 of them, again, total employee. 2 feel like traps to begin with for food delivery drivers, gig workers, etc. And the rest you can kind of go either way, depending on how you decide to battle it out in a courtroom. So when Doordash and Uber Eats said this will not affect independent contractors, there's a part of me that genuinely believes them. Not to mention, they're going to fight tooth and nail to make sure that they are, because they do not want their expenses of the people who work with them to jump up by 30%, probably even more. And like I said, there's no ABC test. This doesn't affect any other worker classification laws. This is just the 6 factors that Biden has administered from the Labor Department upon the FLSA. All in all, I think that we're gonna be okay as independent contractors for Doordash, Uber Eats, Grubhub, and overall in business for ourselves. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. As always, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.